I was helping my uncle with a corn harvest, a task I did every year. It was hard work, but the feeling of being out in the field, away from the city, gave me a strange peace. My uncle's farm had always been isolated, with few people around, which made everything even more tranquil. But that year, something didn't feel right. At first, it was just a strange sensation. The rows of corn, which were usually sturdy and well-aligned, seemed to move slightly, as if there was a strong breeze, but the wind was calm, almost non-existent. As the sun began to set, the feeling of discomfort only grew. My uncle and I fell silent for a moment, watching the field. The shadows between the plants didn't look natural, as if something or someone was moving erratically, but when we looked closer, we couldn't see anything. I tried not to pay attention to it, but the feeling that there was something more in the field made me uneasy. My uncle, as always, ignored anything out of the ordinary, but I could feel something was wrong. That night, we decided to stay awake to keep watch. The farm was large, and we were used to the feeling of being alone out there, but that night was different. We sat on the porch, lanterns lit, trying to observe the rows of corn. The field seemed almost alive. The shadows were sharper now, moving between the plants in a strange way, as if something was there but we couldn't see it. When we pointed the lanterns toward where the shadows were, everything went quiet, as if nothing had happened. It was then, in the absolute silence of the night, that we saw it. Something moving in the middle of the cornfield. It wasn't like an animal or anything natural. It was a dark shape, a shadow that emerged from the middle of the plants, almost as if it were rising from the ground, growing as it lifted out of the earth. I don't know what it was, but when I realized what was happening, panic took over me. I had never run so fast in my life. My uncle and I left everything behind, running toward the house. I didn't look back, but the feeling of being followed, the feeling that something was behind us, didn't let me rest. When we finally reached the house, my body was trembling. The adrenaline was still running strong through my veins, but something inside me told me that it wasn't safe there. The feeling that the field was more alive than ever seemed to grow with every step we took into the house. We hurriedly closed the doors and windows, and still, we couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. Whatever was out there in the middle of the cornfield wasn't something I could simply ignore. We tried to calm down, and for a while, everything was silent. But when the clock struck midnight, we heard something tapping on the house windows. It started softly, almost like a light touch, but soon it grew stronger. The knocks weren't from the wind, as one might think. They were loud and rhythmic, as if something or someone was trying to get in. My uncle, who was always the more skeptical one, didn't want to believe what was happening, but the fear in his eyes didn't lie. I was terrified. What could be outside, tapping on the windows like that? I decided to look out the window, but when I looked at the field, I saw nothing. Just the shadows of the corn moving in the darkness, swaying back and forth as if they were dragging along the ground, but there was no wind. The field seemed to be expanding in some way, as if something was moving within it. I felt like something was calling us, and I didn't know whether I should go or hide. I stood there, motionless, and the noise continued, growing louder. My uncle suddenly got up and went to the door. He wanted to see with his own eyes what was happening, but as soon as he opened the door, something made him stop. A strange presence hung in the air, and he didn't say a word. He slammed the door shut, and the sound of the tapping on the windows stopped abruptly. We stood there, unsure of what to do, waiting for whatever was outside. That night stayed with me forever. The field, the shadows, whatever it was, still haunts me. I don't know what we saw or what was hiding between the plants, but after that night, the farm was never the same. Since then, whenever I pass by the cornfield, the weight of fear still seems to follow me, as if the field is waiting. I was spending the summer at my great-aunt's farm. The farm is in a very isolated place, deep in the woods. I was loving the time there, away from the hustle and bustle of the city. Every day, I would go for long walks through the surrounding forest, exploring the well-known paths. But that day was different. When I decided to venture a bit farther, I noticed something strange. There was a trail that I was sure hadn't been there before. It looked freshly made, with trampled vegetation, but it didn't seem natural. It wasn't like the usual paths we took around there. It was as if someone had made an effort to create this path. The trail seemed to call to me, and instead of going back home like any sensible person would, I kept going, each step becoming more uncomfortable. The air felt heavy, as if something was hanging over me. I couldn't quite place it, but I had a sense that something wasn't right. With each step, the surroundings seemed darker. The daylight didn't penetrate well through the trees, and the shadows were thicker. My heart started to beat faster, but I didn't want to admit to myself that I was scared, so I kept going, thinking it was just paranoia. As I walked further down the trail, the feeling of being watched intensified. I can't explain it, but it was as if I could feel someone behind me or something following me. But when I looked back, no one was there. I started to quicken my pace, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread that seemed to be consuming me little by little. I looked around, but all I could see were dense trees and the sound of the wind rustling the leaves. The trail seemed endless, and the fear only grew. I could hear my own footsteps echoing in an uncomfortable way, as if they were louder than normal, as if the surroundings were waiting for something. But when I took another step, something moved quickly in my peripheral vision like a shadow. But when I turned, I saw nothing. The feeling of being followed became even stronger. I couldn't understand what was happening. I had walked quite a distance, and the trail seemed to stretch on forever. But the strange part was that I no longer recognized the surroundings. It was as if I had entered a completely new place, a space beyond my reach. I turned again, trying to rationalize what I was feeling. But then I saw something. Between the trees, for just a second, something moved quickly. I couldn't see what it was, but it wasn't human. I instinctively knew I shouldn't continue, so I tried to turn back. I started walking back quickly as fast as I could, but the fear was consuming me. The shadows between the trees seemed darker now, and the sound of the leaves moving in the wind sounded louder, as if something was intentionally touching them. My breath was shallow and my whole body was trembling. I looked back once more, and for the first time, I saw something that shouldn't have been there. It was a figure, but it didn't look human. It was just standing there, watching between the trees, as if it was waiting for me. My heart raced, and I ran faster than I've ever run before. As I neared the house, I could already hear my great-aunt's voice from inside. She was there, waiting for me to return for lunch, but I could hardly breathe. I shut the door behind me and went to the window to look outside. The trail had disappeared as if it had never existed. The trees were exactly where they should be, and nothing seemed out of place. I stood there, looking out the window, trying to understand what had happened. I couldn't. There was no explanation for that trail, nor for the feeling of being followed. And even more terrifying, what was that thing I saw between the trees? I spent the rest of the afternoon trying to convince myself that it was all just an illusion. Maybe the exhaustion or the heat of the day had made me see things. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. When night fell, I went to my room, trying to push away any thoughts of what had happened, but I couldn't sleep. The fear that the trail would reappear, that the thing in the shadows would come back, kept me awake all night. The next morning, my great-aunt called me to breakfast, and she seemed to be in an oddly good mood, as if nothing had happened. But I couldn't take my eyes off the forest outside. It was as if something had changed, a sense that what had happened on that trail was somehow connected to that place. I asked her if the trail existed, if anyone else had seen it, and she just looked at me, smiling in a strange way. "This forest has its secrets, my dear," she said, and then changed the subject. In the following days, I went back to the same spot in the forest several times, but I never found the trail again. It was as if it had disappeared, as if it had never existed. To this day, I wonder what happened that day. Did I really see that? Or maybe I fell victim to something much deeper, something we can't understand? The fact is, even now, the feeling of being watched, of being followed by something I can't see, has never left me. I never return to that farm, and every time I pass near a forest, I feel that same chill down my spine, as if the trail is still there, waiting for me. When I was younger, I used to spend summers with my grandfather at a secluded farm deep in the forest. He would always tell me stories about the woods surrounding us, some scary, others funny, but one always intrigued me, the story of the cabin in the middle of the forest. He always spoke of it in a tense way, as if just mentioning it was something that shouldn't be discussed. I remember that when I asked why no one used that cabin, he just looked at me seriously and said, "Better leave it alone." I didn't understand what he meant, but it made me even more curious. Then, during one of my walks in the forest, I came across it. The cabin was right in the middle of a dense area of trees, looking abandoned but strangely well preserved at the same time. Something about it made me uncomfortable, but my curiosity was stronger. As I approached, I noticed the door was slightly ajar. I entered carefully, trying not to make any noise, and inside, everything looked like someone had just abruptly stopped living there in the middle of some routine. The table was set with some dishes and leftover food still visible, and in the back, clothes were hanging on the walls. There were no signs of life, but the feeling that something was wrong was palpable. A chill ran down my spine, but before I could investigate further, a noise outside made me rush back to the door. I glanced back one last time before leaving, and for a second, I thought I saw something moving in the shadows. But no, there was no one, just the strange feeling that this place wasn't as empty as it seemed. When I returned to the farm, I went straight to tell my grandfather what I had found. He seemed nervous, which made me even more uneasy. He didn't scold me, but his look said it all. "I told you not to go there," he said, his voice tense. I insisted that I wanted to show him the cabin, and with a heavy sigh, he agreed to come with me. However, from the moment we started walking along the trail that led to the cabin, the atmosphere in the forest felt different. It was too quiet, as if even the animals were avoiding the place. Every step we took felt heavier and the air grew denser, as if it were laden with something that couldn't be seen, but could be felt. When we finally reached the cabin, an even stranger feeling took over me. There was no longer any food on the table, and the clothes that had been hanging were now on the floor as if someone had rushed out of there. The smell of mold was stronger, and the place seemed even more degraded than I remembered. My grandfather entered the cabin, looked around, and without saying a word, motioned for me to leave. Before I stepped out, I looked one last time at the dark corner of the cabin, and for a moment I could have sworn I saw a shadow move inside. When I looked again, there was nothing, just the emptiness and the growing feeling that this place wasn't normal, and that somehow the cabin knew we were there. We left the cabin, and my grandfather didn't say a word during the walk back. The silence between us was uncomfortable. When we got home, he told me to go to my room, and for the first time I saw a side of my grandfather I had never seen before. He was tense, nervous, almost afraid. Over the next few days, he avoided talking about what had happened, but I could see that he was distressed. Something about that cabin terrified him, but he refused to tell me. Deep down, I knew something was terribly wrong, but I didn't know what. I felt like a weight on my shoulders, that there was something my grandfather wasn't telling me. Something he desperately didn't want me to know. A week later, my grandfather left for the city, and I was left alone on the farm. I decided I had to go back to that cabin, just to try to understand what had happened. Something inside me was telling me I couldn't leave it behind. The feeling of being watched, that the forest was full of invisible eyes, wouldn't leave me in peace. When I arrived at the cabin, it was exactly as it had been the last time I saw it. But this time, when I entered, something was different. The air was heavier and the furniture was in slightly different positions. There were marks on the floor as if something or someone had been dragged across the room. The silence was oppressive, and I felt a presence, something watching me. I went to the table where the food crumbs were still visible and touched the surface. It was cold, as if time had stopped there, but at the same time there was a strange feeling that the space was alive. Suddenly, I heard a noise coming from upstairs. I couldn't identify the sound, but it was a faint scratching, as if something was moving upstairs. My instinct was to run out of there, but something stopped me. Something held me in that house. I decided to carefully climb the stairs, and as each step creaked beneath my feet, the feeling of being watched intensified. When I reached the top, the door to one of the rooms was ajar, and a strange, faint light emanated from within. My hand hesitated before pushing the door open, but I did it. What I saw froze me completely. The room was empty except for a strange, dusty mirror leaning against the wall. Its reflection didn't match the room. It seemed to be showing a different place, a place that shouldn't be there, a place with a dark presence. The reflection seemed like a distorted version of the room, and in the corner of the mirror, something or someone seemed to be moving closer to me. The cold feeling in my spine was instantaneous. I could see that thing in my reflection before it started moving in my direction. When I looked back, no one was in the room. The only thing left was the mirror. The feeling of panic took over me, and before I could fully process what was happening, I began to hear footsteps coming from inside the house. They weren't mine. There was no one else there but me, or at least I thought there wasn't. I felt a presence behind me, closer than I would have liked to admit. The door to the room, which had been ajar, slammed shut with a bang that almost made me jump out of my skin. In a panic, I ran for the stairs, but before I could reach the door, something stopped me. I looked back and saw a strange figure in the mirror, someone with their back turned, looking at me. The image terrified me to the point that I couldn't move. I knew it wasn't real, but my body was paralyzed with fear. With the little courage I had left, I ran down the stairs, not looking back, and slammed the door behind me. I heard a whisper, a muffled voice that seemed to come from inside the cabin, but I was far enough away to ignore it. I returned to the farm as quickly as I could, still haunted by the images of the mirror and the figure in my mind. When I arrived, I told my grandfather everything, but he just looked at me with an expression I couldn't understand. He knew, of course. He knew everything. Yet, he didn't say a word. After that day, the cabin was never mentioned again, and I never sought it out. But years later, when I asked about it again, my grandfather simply said, "Some things shouldn't be disturbed. Sometimes we're not meant to know what's out there." To this day, I don't know if what I saw was real or just in my head, but since then, I've never returned to that forest, and something tells me I never should.